Okay, are we ready to go, Georgie?
Yeah, I'm just giving people just a few more seconds to join through, then we'll go. So, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone. My name is Joji Waits, the Head of Flight Safety at British Airline Pilots Association, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this second BALPA-hosted event, in which we're looking to further our understanding and stimulate discussion on a range of progressive safety topics. It's humbling to see people here from all over the world and from such a diverse range of organisations. It's also great to see some familiar names returning from our first conference. Talking of this first conference, which was held back in February of this year, our aim was to convey the benefits in seeing things from a system point of view, to appreciate complexity in our day-to-day work, and to learn from all experiences, not just those that have gone wrong in the past, and basically to provide enough intrigue for you to want to learn more. With this conference today, we are hoping to take things a bit further in providing a platform to gain foundational knowledge of complexity, which will help create a paradigm shift in understanding needed to take advantage of modern safety concepts that are currently being progressed, both within aviation and other complex industries. Beyond these insights into complex adaptive systems, we will also share some of the practical work being done through partnership between BALPA Flight Safety, Cranfield University and Cognitive Edge. The format for today is a combination of styles, including presentation, tutorial, Q&A, and audience participation. We'd like this to be a much more interactive session, so please be ready to contribute your thoughts and your experience. This will culminate, hopefully, in some real-time data feedback later in the session. We will be taking a 15-minute break, about 3 p.m. UK time, so roughly about halfway through, and we aim to finish by 5. There may be an opportunity for an informal post-conference online discussion, and we'll say a bit more about this later on. This leads to a brief piece of housekeeping. Those familiar with Zoom will know there's a chat function. Please use this to chat amongst yourselves or to make observations as we go along. However, for specific questions aimed at our speakers, please use the dedicated Q&A function. We really would appreciate your cooperation here, as it's much easier for us to track and collate your questions through this mechanism. In terms of the Q&A, we're going to be quite flexible, so please feel free to submit your questions as and when you think of them, and we'll pitch them at the appropriate time. Also, to let you know that this session will be recorded, and the recording will be made available on the BALPA Safety Conference website, together with the presentation slides at a later date. Given the large number of people online, we've had to turn cameras off and to also mute people that are not speaking. So you haven't given up your valuable time to hear me go on, so we'll get on to the main event. But just before that happens, I cannot end this introduction without expressing my gratitude to our speakers for today. So Gary Wong, Sonia Blino, Cengiz Tokoglu, and together with my BALPA colleague James Burnell. Thank them for their generous time and effort in organising and preparing for this conference. They will introduce themselves individually as we progress through the event. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Gary Wong, who will explain in more detail the session that we have planned for you today, beginning with some reflections on the BALPA February Safety Conference. So Gary, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Georgie. And hello to everyone around the world. One of the things we may want to do is just test out the Zoom webinar chat panel and see if it's working for you. How about if you just type in what you're eating or drinking right now? For me, it's 5 a.m. in the morning, Vancouver time, so I'm having my usual, actually earlier than usual, breakfast coffee. Let me share my slides with you now. Okay, so there we go. Well, as Georgie said, today's safety conference is a continuation of the one held in February. There were several gems in the presentations that resonated with me. If you recall, day one was introduction to safety 2 thinking and the concepts of safety born from an understanding of complexity and systems thinking. Eric Hollnagel reminded us, accidents don't occur that often, although we do spend an inordinate amount of time and resources investigating them. Most things go well because we know how to monitor, anticipate, respond, and learn. These are the resilience potentials. Eric defined the differences between safety 1 and safety 2. Safety 1 has few things as possible going wrong. Safety 2 has many things as possible going right. Later, John Kwasny explained in American Airlines, safety 1 and safety 2 are not treated as either or, but both and. John Holbrook described how learning in NASA aligns with the decision makers wanting to make data-informed decisions about system management and system design. Well, what do we mean by system? Stephen Schwach described two systems, a complicated mechanical and a complex social technical. Each system behaves differently, and so are the interventions. In his pyramid, and later an iceberg diagram, he spoke about patterns and how we can observe by anticipating, perhaps, we can influence pattern changes, resulting in better outcomes. Robert DeBoer shared insights on turning theory into practical applications. He discussed how to break dominant paradigms of safety thinking by launching safe to fail micro experiments. By safe to fail, we mean if the experiment does fail, that's okay, since the learning gain is greater than the small investment made. The second day continued to focus on the practical implementation of these new safety concepts. And in the latter part of the second day, we heard the views from the regulators. And I'm using Todd Conklin's safety spear to show where the regulators are located down at the blunt end. And of course, BELPA, they're at the sharp end. We saw practical applications with a strong emphasis on learning. James talked about American Airlines, a learning and improvement team's model, and their own interpretation of the resilience potentials. Next was the regulatory role of FAA, shifting from enforcer to collaborator. Sean Carrick said instead of money spent paying fines, FAA would rather see investments in leadership and command training and mentoring programs, looking for adherence to policies, procedures, and SOPs, and that crews develop their decision-making and critical thinking skills. I personally found Cathay Pacific's 4 cornerstones of risk management really insightful. Obviously, there's a preparations cornerstone, then being aware of environmental conditions, as well as the conditions of the people you're working with that day. Margins, standing close to the edge, but not falling over. For me, these 2 cornerstones means being aware and sensing when we are drifting into failure. And lastly, monitoring personal attitude is a way of managing risk, perhaps as a leading rather than a lagging indicator. Val then shared their 6-step operational learning review process. I'd like to just highlight their step 4, which is analysis and sense making of the information collected. Ivan Pupolitti spoke about fighting wildfires in the US forest. In their learning journey, they identified what experts can do compared to a novice, and how they might increase the capacity of experts to recognize novel situations. Similar to Cathay Pacific's OLR process, The Forest Services Learning Review after an incident also has an analysis and sense-making step. If its analysis is what we call reductionism, looking down and breaking the system into its parts, sense-making is looking up and discovering patterns in the system that Stephen Schwach spoke about. Both Val and Ivan chimed in about the complex narrative. There was only one event that happened, but there can be many people telling their own version of the event based on what they experienced. Catherine Jones spoke about regulatory developments applying the systems thinking approach. She introduced the ICAO Human Performance Manual for regulators and the 5 human performance principles. The purpose is to support regulators to make it easy for people in the aviation system to do the right thing. Ed Corbett, at Health and Safety Executive, saw no issues with the new view perspectives to advance safety thinking and hope that the challenges that may arise with polarized views can be overcome. Other challenges to be mindful of can surface from using new language. You heard a lot about work as imagined and work as done over the 2 days. Psychological safety is another. In the Q&A panel, I heard 2 stories when speaking up in the cockpit was really difficult to do. And finally, Ed shared some leadership traps. I thought these neatly link back to Sean's FFA leadership and command training slide, attributes, roles, styles, and leadership. That was quite a melting pot of information resources, and I only touched on a few of them. So what I'd like to do now is ask a poll question for you to help me understand where you are in your understanding of complexity. What I'm using is a variation of the expertise scale that Ivan presented. In this scale, understanding complexity means knowing when you're in a complex situation and when you're not. In other words, situation awareness, plus knowing what decision method to use to match the context. Or another way to say this is the ability to use a hammer to hit a nail, but not when it's a screw. So how about, James, if you can bring up the poll and let's just see where people are. So how are people doing on the poll? Can we show the results?
I think I might have to end the polling to show the results. 69% of people have voted so far.
Okay, so it's,
There we go, I'll end it.
okay, so we're getting, if you look at those bars, looks like we're getting a bit of a bell curve. We have some experts, and we have some people who feel that they're proficient. A lot of people in the competent area, down in the advanced beginner and the novices. Okay, so that's helpful for me to understand that. What I'll do though is for the benefit of the advanced beginners and novices, I will kind of keep it at that level there. And if the experts and the proficient people, we can actually have a chat later and maybe share some thoughts, but I have some other slides which I can share with those folks as well. But what I want to do is kind of look at all those real cool concepts and suggest that we probably need a framework to help you make sense of where these concepts belong and how they fit together. So let's build one together. As the conference aim states, our approach is grounded in scientific theory. The science we base our thinking upon is natural science, chemistry, astronomy, earth science, physics, and biology. At one level, the natural world appears to be uncertain, unpredictable, ambiguous, volatile. And we call this a complex system. Extreme weather storms are good examples. Hurricanes, tornadoes. Fortunately, these extreme events eventually dissipate all of their energy and they do die out. When living things are involved, we call it a complex adaptive system. That's because living things will avoid dying and adapt to survive. We also observe underlying patterns of order in the natural world. Some are hidden, waiting to be discovered by humans. For example, apples. They were falling off trees long before Newton came along and created the natural law of gravity. The size of animals follows some sense of order. A mouse would never be as large as an elephant. Humans, males, average 1.8 meters in height, while females average 1.6. The more fascinating patterns of order are watching fish swarm in formation or birds flocking in the air. Now, humans are different than other living organisms. We possess what we call the three I's: intelligence, intent, identity. We really like this idea of order and what it offers: certainty, stability, predictability, consistency, repeatability. Those are really cool things that we kind of like. And over time, we've learned how to use our intelligent brains to create order. We've even organized a hierarchy based on size, as you can see by this diagram on the right. And even though whales are much larger than humans, our ego positions us at the top of the food chain. It's also very clear that the person who drew up this chart was a male chauvinist. Apologies to the ladies in the room. Using our intelligence, we can impose constraints to create an order system. So constrained that we can actually create if-then cause and effect relationships. What do we call these constraints? Regulations, standards, policies, subsystems, org structures, processes, procedures, and rules. We've become really good at creating those things as humans. Intent means within this order system, we as humans are able to articulate a purpose, a vision statement, a mission, and can imagine a future state of being. And identity says, as individuals, we each can play different roles: work, family, community. So we're one living organism with the capability to behave differently depending on the role we're in and the context that we are facing. There's a third natural system called chaotic. Everything is totally random, no rhyme, no reason, no logic. It's a system we enter when unexpected failure occurs, like an accident, machine breakdown, building collapse, or worst of all, a fatality. It's also a temporary state. You don't stay in it for long. You act quickly to get out of chaos. And if you don't act quickly, somebody else will. On the other hand, falling into chaos can reveal positive opportunities. We actually have a word for that. It's called serendipity. We can also deliberately fall into chaos, contain the initial consequences, and manage the outcomes. We also have a word for that. We call it disruptive innovation. In safety, the intent is to avoid chaos. So we have used our intelligence to create different approaches, like safety 1, 2, safety 3, hop, new view. The safety differently view I have been exploring for several years is that safety is an emergent property of a complex adaptive system. When a violent storm unexpectedly appears, if you're flying in an airplane, you adapt to survive. You change existing human imposed constraints, hoping that safety emerges. But we must also be alert because our adjustments may enable danger to emerge. This graphic shows the 3 systems on a single plane. A complex adaptive system contains all 3 systems. 2 are natural and 1 is human imposed. You don't remain in one system, but you will move from one system to another in order to get work done. The boundary between order and chaos represents a physical cliff that you can fall over. Think of taking a piece of paper and folding it over, creating an edge. And if you've heard the term edge of chaos, it is represented by this boundary. The red arc moving between complex and order, or from going from chaos to complex, is a transitional mental shift, not an abrupt physical change. All industries, like aviation, are complex adaptive systems. And all organizations within the industry are complex adaptive systems. I said earlier, we need a framework to make sense of the real world and maybe help us make decisions. So let's do that. What we'll do is that we'll split the order system into 2 domains, complicated and clear. We'll add 1 domain in the middle. We'll call it confused. This is the state of not knowing where you are. This is the Cynefin framework. It's a sense-making framework. We make sense of the present situation so that we can act appropriately. This is how the Cynefin framework is drawn. As we saw earlier, the boundary between the clear and chaotic domains is a physical cliff, and that's represented by that little squiggly brown area down at the bottom. Falling over the cliff means failure has occurred. Now, Cynefin allows you to understand how to act. Each domain has its own decision-making method and tools. But the key thing to remember is that no domain is better than any other. Let's look at the clear domain. It has rigid constraints, such as safety rules and best practices. Decision-making in the clear domain is sense, categorize, respond. You've seen this situation before, and you're trained to get things done. There's really only one right answer, so comply and just do it. In the complicated domain, that's where the experts reside. And they use a decision-making method that's sense, analyze, and respond. Experts also develop governing constraints to manage the business and the organization. If these experts can't agree on a problem fix or want a new solution, they will move into the complex domain to test out and use another different decision-making method. They will probe, sense, and respond. This means conducting trial and error experiments to discover a new idea that emerges as a solution. If we fall into the chaotic domain, the decision-making process is get the hell out of there as quickly as possible. So we act, sense, and respond. The domain in the middle, confuse, covers those situations where you don't know what to do. You have some choices. You could choose to deliberately stay there, wait it out, and observe how things unfold, or choose to head to another domain and follow its decision-making method. You hear people often say, oh, they're always in constant chaos. That's what it feels like. I would agree if uncontrollable damage is being inflicted upon them and personal safety is being attacked. However, if they're not in any physical danger, they're probably just in the confused domain and unsure what to do next. Let's look how this Cynefin framework and how we can actually use it to map events. What you're seeing now is a mapping of COVID-19. Now, the Cynefin framework, or Cynefin for short, helps to describe various events and activities and where they belong. If we start in the clear domain, everyone with a bit of training, including your kids, can do anything there. Wash hands, stay at home. We can also do panic hoarding. The position of each item actually in the domain has some meaning. If you know, civic lockdown is located near the clear chaotic boundary because it's an extreme measure to avoid disaster. And conspiracy theorists are in the far right corner of the clear domain. Why? Because they're unwilling to shift from the very clear, to them, ideals and deeply held beliefs. Experts, apologies for that. Experts in the complicated domain run operational dashboards and develop controlling constraints based on science. It's also the domain of so-called expert analysts spreading myths and pseudoscience. The complex domain is a mix of experts, lay people, and this is where the politicians and elected officials hang out. Finding a vaccine is a lot of disciplined trial and error, scientific work. If you want to shape a new normalcy, that too will mean experimenting to see what works and doesn't work. Anyone reopening a shop, facility, plant faces uncertainty and unpredictability. Nobody really knows if reopening is a good idea or a bad idea. All that we know is that there will be unintended consequences, both positive and negative. Self-quarantine is also an experiment. 14 days or more near the chaotic domain border. It's uncertain that you will be fine, get sick, be hospitalized, or die from the disease. What I'm showing the chaotic domain, I think everybody can see, is violent attacks and protests, riots, and looting. And those are the things that you want to escape from and really not be in the chaotic domain. Well, let's create a similar Cynefin map for aviation safety. And I've done that. I've taken some of those things, those concepts, which I earlier presented, and I've just mapped them on a Cynefin domain. So let's look at all these. In the clear domain, training is a huge component. Now, just frontline workers adhere to SOPs and sense, categorize, respond to get work done. This is the slide that Sean Carrick presented, and where training is very, very important, a huge component. The complicated mechanical system obviously resides in the Cynefin complicated domain. The FAA, CAA, HSE regulators work here as well. They develop the governing constraints, such as regulations and standards, to guide worker behavior in the industry. Management devises policies, leadership roles and responsibilities, org structures, processes, rules, and procedures to direct clear domain workers. Risk management is a good practice performed by experts in the complicated domain. One of the fun things about mapping is you can put a concept where it is and have some conversations, because I may be quite off base where it is, and somebody can come along with better knowledge and kind of say, well, I think it belongs here. For example, I'm showing the complex social technical system that Stephen Schrock showed, straddling the complicated complex border. Because I think the people in operations must deal with known knowns and known unknowns in the complicated domain, as well as unknown unknowns in the Kinevin complex domain. I'm also showing American Airlines learning and improvement teams on the border. I could be wrong, and I look forward to being corrected by James, but I think they are involved in documenting and implementing process changes, which is in the complicated domain. Micro experiments clearly are conducted in the complex domain, since the outcomes are unpredictable. And learning reviews, where their sense-making steps belong here. Let's put this all together and ask another question. How much time is spent in each Kinevin domain? Well, I'm not a pilot, so I'll give you my perception as an airline passenger. As Eric Holnagel said, most things go well. And I am really confident that you are well trained and follow the rigid safety rules as pilots in the cockpit. And that includes the experience I had sitting on the Vancouver airport tarmac from 4 p.m. to 1 a.m. one time due to a sudden freezing rainstorm. All that we were told was the plane was taxiing back to the gate, then later moved to another gate for the wings to be de-iced. I admit I was annoyed when I saw the midnight flight, the red eye didn't want to take, leave before us. But I understand that's all part of being in the clear and complicated, the clear domain, and you're just following standard operating procedures. 95% of the time is my guess is what you spend in the clear and complicated domains. So this idea that we're always in complexity, I'm putting out this thought, well, no, because we have developed this system of order and we can introduce constraints, both governing and rigid, it makes a whole lot of sense to stay there because we can predict outcomes. And frankly, if I'm flying on a plane as your passenger, I want you to be able to predict an outcome that we will land safely. This is an intriguing area. I'm guessing that you spend maybe about 3% of your time navigating away from the boundary between the clear and the chaotic domains. And you do that by recognizing patterns and applying your intuition, your tacit knowledge. And this is really important because the human brain was not designed to read and write documents, but to recognize patterns and to do it very, very quickly. We have this fear about artificial intelligence coming to replace humans. Well, I will be one to push back and say, I don't think that will happen, because right now the human brain can process and read patterns, which algorithms can't do yet. We also have this ability to anticipate and look ahead. And of course, AI can't do that because they're coded based on the past. Now, I know that there are programs being built where perhaps there's machine learning as you go, But I'm talking about those novel situations, the situations that Ivan talked about, where we as humans can see what's happening well before any machine can. Now, why 3%? Well, typically the plane in the air, you're confronting uncontrollable weather conditions that you may sense danger is emerging. From your monitoring, you anticipate turbulence. So you turn on the seatbelt warning indicators and tell us over the PA system that we may encounter some bumpiness. Or in a more suspense-filled experience, one time I was flying at night into St. John's, Newfoundland, but due to stormy winter conditions, you announced that we might divert and land in Gander. Well, we all responded with a collective groan in the cabin. But then the cabin went eerily quiet for what seemed an eternity, not knowing where we were going. So in some respects, we were all in that confused domain, just not sure what was going to happen. And I recall to this day, when we felt the wheels touch the ground, we all held our breath and let out a really good cheer when the attendant said, "Welcome to St. John's." So in total, if you look at the clear and the complicated domain, I think you spend 98% of the time in the order system, or the clear and the complicated domains. So where is that remaining 2%? Well, of course, I'm in my view, it's 0%, because we're not going to fall in the chaotic domain. You're not going to allow a failure to happen. We're going to crash. So the remaining 2% is figuring out how to get out of there quickly. The first response that you would do is stabilize the situation. And that's moving into this confused domain. Sometimes it's a move that buys you some time to think and decide. Maybe it's a problem you've never experienced before. So you need to communicate with someone who has that experience and can kind of suggest this is what you need to do. But if that resource isn't available, then I think you will move into the complex domain and experiment using your hunches. A good example is Apollo 13. And if you recall what happened, they had issues with a rise in the carbon monoxide. So they had to create a carbon monoxide scrubber in the capsule using whatever limited resources they had. These percentages that I came up with are you in the cockpit of a commercial airliner supported by operational staff. I'm sure they will be different if you're flying a bush plane into some remote territory or fighting a forest fire, uncertain if your SOPs are really going to work. For those of you not in operations, but involved in safety system design, the majority of your time will be in the complex and complicated domains. Sonia later will be speaking more about what happens in the complex domain and how you're able to be responsible, or actually we'll call it response-able. Work in the clear and complicated domain falls under safety 1 and what we term robustness. This is the work that has been going on for, let's say, 100 years, trying to create robustness, and started off looking at humans as machines, humans being error prone, and we moved into the phase of human factors, recognize that humans, well, we're more than just cogs of a machine, but we have the ability to think and act, but we're still hazards. So we need to have controls and rules to manage our behavior. Now we got into more looking at the systems view, the systems thinking viewpoint, and looking at safety management. And now I'm suggesting that we're even going further than that with safety two thinking and understanding why things go well. And that's what we do in the complex domain, as well as down, of course, in that red zone area. We probe with experiments, monitor the consequences, learn what works and doesn't work, and respond with new solutions to make a system more resilient. Dave Snowden also describes resilience as early detection, which is that red zone, the area between the clear and the chaotic boundary. I like to suggest this is safety too, making performance adjustments to back away from the cliff. And you can, when you look at the entire Cynefin framework, you can see why we say safety one and safety two is not a both and dichotomy. Is not an either or dichotomy, but it's a both and. So that's a kind of a brief complexity 101 overview, introducing Cynefin as a framework. Let's return to that poll question and let me know just from that brief overview, where do you stand? Can you actually rate yourself again? And let's see if there's any changes. So James, can you bring up that poll question again? Okay, just looking. Looks like we've been able to raise some bars. So hopefully we raised the level of competence. Half of you feel that, which is good. So that makes me happy. We've reduced the novice and advanced beginners. And looks like we're good. Okay, thank you for that. That's very helpful. Let me just kind of look at where we are here. Okay. If you are in the advanced and the proficient, as well as the expert, here are a couple of extra things for you. If you're proficient, that means you know how to navigate all around the Cynefin framework. This actually is what we call the liminal version of Cynefin. We've introduced a couple of green areas. But this map that we've got, or this framework, also shows it from a knowledge point of view. In the clear domain, you work with known knowns. In the complicated, you work with known unknowns. And that's what we call risk. You know something about it, but you don't know when or how big. So what we do is that we estimate probabilities and severities. And we say there's a certain percentage that this may happen, and this is how big it's going to be. This is also the area of doing scenario planning. What's interesting, if you look at that boundary between clear and chaotic, this is the area of what we call unknown knowns. This is the area that you feel, you sense that you're getting close to the chaotic border, but maybe you're not quite sure what to do. That's when you consult the experts or somebody that says, oh, I know what to do. Here's what you do. In other words, you may not know about it, but somebody else does. This also has great implications for management, because in many cases, it's management where you're sitting in the office, you're not 100% sure what's happening in the field. And often when there's an accident investigation, how often do we hear managers saying, why am I the last one to find out about this? Or if I had known about this, I could have done something better. This is what Dave Snowden talks about, early detection. How can we kind of like avoid those stories of like, I knew this was going to happen, to those better stories like, thank God we caught that. The knowledge was shared so that we can back away from the boundary and move back into a more safe operating area. We've also got in the 2 green liminal areas. Now by liminal, by the green areas, what I'm referring to are unimagined unknowns and unimagined unknowns. Now, again, this is a little bit deeper. I won't go further than that. But liminal means that this is a kind of a holding zone. So you just don't go zip from one domain to another, but you kind of hold it for a while or think about it, kind of check out options, test things before you move into the other domain. And of course, by definition, unknown unknowns are in the complex, and in the chaotic domain, it's the unimaginables and the unknowables. Now, if you're an expert, that means you know how to make change. Most of us know how to make change in the complex domain, and there's a ton of change management practices that have been going on for over 100 years. But there aren't too many practices that know how to actually make change starting in the complex domain. This is what you as an expert will learn. What I'm showing you on the right is what we call the vector theory of change. This is where we actually use behavior economics. We use nudging. And we also draw these interesting maps. And this is using complexity science. We introduce what we call the adjacent possible. We also look at saying, how do we get more stories in the green area where the job gets done and there's compliance to the rules? Because right now, we're in the kind of in the red and the brown, where we're not getting the job done, or maybe we're getting the job done, but there's no compliance with the rules. How do we shift that? As an expert, you will understand that you cannot go straight from the red and the brown to the green. It's just too difficult. So what we have to do is we have to search for what Stuart Kaufman calls the adjacent possible to kind of get there. Okay. So just checking the time, James or Joji, before Sonia comes on. How much time do we have left? We can do some quick Q&A. I think Sonia's coming up next. I think this is her slide that she wants to show. So let me stop sharing and let's just do a time check. Where are we right now?
So you're a little bit ahead, Gary, about 5 to 10 minutes ahead. So if you want to take some questions, we have time. But equally, we can go into Sonia's piece next. Yeah,
let's do that. And by the way, Sonia, hi Sonia. If you want to answer some of those Kevin questions that may be raised, by all means, let's do that together. So James, do we have any questions?
I have some questions at the moment, but everyone's welcome to stick them in the Q&A box if they come up. You spoke earlier to me about how you saw Cynefin being used. Have you got some good examples there in the real world?
Yeah, I mean, the Cynefin framework has been around for quite some time. In fact, we just celebrated 20 years and published a book. It's been used in police work, international development, public policy, military, counterterrorism, safety. I've used a lot in electrical, energy, utility business, construction, healthcare, sales, education, and today it's the aviation industry. Have I missed anything, Sonia?
Some people actually use it as a, for personal development. It's a
Yeah.
interesting, Cynefin, it's a bit of a, I like to think of it as a meta framework. So, you can use it to make sense kind of on any level. It's a bit fractal, so I think the first time I encountered it, I've never been able to look at my own life the same way. once I understood Cynefin, so it's one of, it's the question I hate the most is when people ask me what I do, because I can't answer that question, because the things that we work with apply across. So yeah, and I don't think you missed anything, Gary.
So
I'd like to add though, it's used a lot for strategy. And typically in the complicated domain, we do what we call idealistic strategy. What is that? Well, we define a future state. From that, we kind of build a linear roadmap, and then we kind of like create milestones, and we do KPI and targets. All good things if you're in the complicated domain, and you know that you've got some stability, you've got predictability and repeatability. But now what we're finding out, because the complexity is kind of growing, is that we have to do what we call the emergent strategy or naturalistic strategy. So we don't quite know what the future is going to look like. And it's probably not a good idea that we make a big bet and gamble our future and something that may not materialize. So I like that phrase, Sonia, that we kind of use, like, oh, we want to get to the other side of the creek, but there's a fast flowing stream. How do we do that? Well, we have to cross the stream by feeling the pebbles in the water, doing one step at a time. I think that sort of analogy really sticks with me, because you just don't know where you're going. We also call it, as I mentioned, a bit of a vector theory of change. Is it's difficult to say, like, I want to go and land where that tree is across there, knowing that you've got these uncontrollable forces. You may say, like, no, I think from a fuzzy point of view, just want to get to the bank, because as you're crossing pebble by pebble, something all of a sudden may materialize over the horizon. And by God, there's a better spot to land than that tree. So it makes a lot of sense. Well, let's head over to that location, where if you're a project manager, and I've fortunately seen this, oh no, we laid out our roadmap and we must go there, and you push back to maybe a future that does no longer make any sense. We also use it in operations. One of the first usage of Cynefin was by Dave, working with DARPA and using it with the military forces in Afghanistan in 2004. And now Dave shares a story about SWAT teams being trained to apply Cynefin in hostage situations. So you can imagine the team is on the ground assessing the situation. If they believe it's in the clear domain, well, it's just standard operating procedures, and let's just do it. But if they don't have enough information to understand, what do? Well, they have to probe, sense, and respond. I think the real value, though, comes when they have to report back to command. Since leaders are also trained in using Cynefin, the SWAT team can simply say, it's complex, so we're probing. And they get full backing of leadership saying, yeah, go ahead and probe, find out and understand and see what it is. And then we'll have to come back and maybe assess from what you learn. Because how often and I've seen that with just local firefighting crews, they'll go on upon a situation, and then the commander will come in and just go like, oh, no, we can't do that. We got to do this here, and cause a lot of confusions. I've got a neighbor that is a firefighter, and when I talk to him, that's the first thing he says, that we're so disconnected from command and control. And I just wanted to say, well, I can show you something that would really work, that would help you guys out. And of course, that's the Cynefin framework.
Yeah, I guess in the pandemic, it could have been very useful for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I think is most useful about Cynefin is it helps you understand that we are in different kinds of systems all the time. And I think when complexity kind of thinking only when it came into the business world, it kind of came along with this almost like a message of everything is complex, you can't manage. It was, and that almost gave people an allergic reaction to it. And I think what I like about Cynefin is it shows us that there are always still ordered aspects that we're dealing with, but then we can't afford to ignore complexity. and even confusion. You know, we need to become contextually intelligent. And as Gary said, that shared language that comes from using Cynefin at different levels in organizations, it's really, really useful.
Mhm.
Thanks for that. We've got a question there come in. The aviation industry most of the time falls in the clear and complicated domain, but slowly moving into the complex domain in terms of how we interface with high technology equipment. What is the best way on how to understand and appreciate managing a complex domain in terms of awareness and training?
If it is, I think we got to be careful that if it's high tech, difficult solutions, that's not necessarily mean they're complex. They could be complicated, and it may take a bit of training and education to show operating staff and pilots how these things work. Now, if it's a learning team that's introducing a new concept, feedback is so important. Because how often have we introduced a new tool into the field and the operators kind of go like, well, this doesn't quite work because of so-and-so. That's where that learning team really goes into the complex domain to figure out, well, what is something else we need to do? And it's a bit of an iteration sort of thing that kind of goes on. And that's why I showed the American Airlines LIT model, kind of straddling that border between complicated and complex. Maybe they're going to introduce some new high-tech sort of solutions, but they don't quite know how it works. So they'll do it, they'll test it, and if it works, they'll come back and try something else. And this is a loop, and this is what Sonia talked about here. We're not fixed in one domain. We will move around depending on the context. And if we think that we've got a really solid solution in the complicated domain, then we'll document that and we'll implement that. And perhaps we'll even turn into a best practices. Although I think, as Sonia says, the complexity is growing so much, we want to be very careful about putting too many things down into the clear domain as a best practice. One reason why, as you can see by the Cynefin framework, is because if you move it out of clear domain, you introduce that border between chaos and clear, which you may inadvertently fall over. And that's that drifting into failure.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah.
I'm just aware that Cynefin Centre has released in association with the EU Commission, a document. So do you guys want to share that here? Is that useful for everyone, do you think? Yeah,
go ahead, Sonia. You want to talk a bit about that?
I can talk a bit about it. I don't have it handy to share, James, but
I have the link.
Yeah, if you've got the link, feel free to share. Yeah, that is, so when just at the start of the pandemic, Dave started a collaboration with one of the areas in the EU to create a really practical document for how to manage in complexity and chaos. And so it's very much linked to Cynefin, but as you'll see, it's much broader than just the framework, and it's quite practical, taking you through 4 discrete steps, for example, with different things that you can do in each of the steps. So I think it could be quite useful for this audience. Right now, we're working on creating what's called an assessment, so where people can almost plot where they are, according to these various stages. And so I think maybe just to add to what Gary was saying about the, in answer to the previous question, I think sometimes the introduction of new technology does create more complexity. It's interesting. So complexity comes from things being interconnected. So if you've got 2 completely different software systems or computer systems, as long as they're separate, they are complicated. The moment they need to connect and interface, then you start getting all kinds of unintended consequences. And I think I don't, and maybe a caveat, even before I start speaking, the aviation industry is not somewhere where I've got a lot of expertise. So please call me on it if I say something really stupid. But very often when I speak at conferences, and I don't want to go through the full Cynefin thing, I would just give people an idea of how we progressively interact with more complex and complicated kinds of systems. So we learn to become mobile using a bicycle. And then at some stage, most of us learn how to drive a car. And, then we enter traffic and it becomes complex because now we need to be aware because there are other drivers on the road that we don't know how they're going to react. We're dealing with these unknown unknowns. And now they've introduced cars that's connected to the internet. So now all of a sudden, I don't need to only think about the other drivers, but now I can potentially, my car can be hacked. And every time something like this, when things start connecting in different ways, I think that is where complexity tends to increase. So it's not necessarily a new technology. If that new technology creates more of a interconnectedness and non-linear connections in particular that we need to really think about. And the training aspect, I think it's realizing that complexity is a completely different kind of system. It's not just higher order complicatedness, it's a different type of system. So it's almost as different as a zoo is from a jungle. So how the skills that you need and how you impart those are pretty different from what you'll do in a ordered system.
Well, thanks for that. There's one more question, but I'm aware the time's ticking on a wee bit. Can you talk a little more about what a probe might look like?
So another at its best, at its most simple, a probe is an interaction with a system. It's when I first met Dave, he would talk about you interact and you almost like you probe, you disturb the system to emerge patterns and see how it responds. So other words that we use for this is safe to fail experiments. But the whole idea of a probe is that you need to make it safe to fail, small, local, and the reason why you're probing is to learn about the system, not necessarily to create a success. So it really is this process of interacting with the system and learning about the system as you go. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes probing is playing a hunch because you don't know what's going to go. So you should just try something. I kind of use that sometimes when I'll probe, when I find that crews are frustrated, particularly in my case, electrical line crews. They're frustrated because they can't do something. And one example was they were the WorkSafe organization imposed having to use what we call high voltage or low voltage rubber gloves, these big thick things working in small control panels. And the crews were really frustrated, electricians were. So I suggested, why don't we probe? Why don't we just say, okay, for this one department, you don't have to use low voltage rubber gloves. And it's kind of like, let's find out what's going to happen. Obviously, there's safe to fail, which means you don't want anybody physically to get hurt, whatever. And the guys are saying, well, it's low voltage, we're not going to get hurt. I have more concerns about trying to handle a small screwdriver with these big thick gloves. So they can experiment. And then from that, we learn. And it's a small investment. Then you can decide, because one of the things we can't control is we can either accelerate that, amplify it. Let's try another department. Or else we consider, oh, that was a bad idea. We better dampen it and shut that down. Don't bring that up again. Again, it's trial and error. We just don't know. I mean, you see that actually in the world of sport all the time. They're always probing, finding new ways, in particular soccer. A good example is how do we attack and how do we defend? You don't know because you don't know how the other team is going to respond. So you try something out. That's really what probing is all about.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much for that. Gary, I'm aware at the end of your presentation you were going to hand over to Sonia and introduce her. Can you do that?
Yeah, okay, happy to. Well, I'm really pleased to introduce Sonia. Of course, you can read about her on the BALPA website, but Sonia and I go back a few years, and it's been a fun time together. I'm happy that James, you asked Sonia to be here. I think she can, and her talk is going to be about responsibility, which again was a major theme that came out in the February conference. So other than that, I'm not going to say too much because I want to, Sonia, you get right into there and just let's talk a bit about that. Over to you.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, I don't know how long it's been, but it seems like we've known each other for ages. Maybe just a little bit of background. I come from the natural sciences, so I studied meteorology. And then, about 20 years ago, I met Dave Snowden, and that's when I was introduced to the idea of complexity. And I think it resonated because of my science background, but I was just immediately fascinated. I loved the integrity, the inherent integrity and complexity, because one of the key organizing principles is that context matters, and every context is essentially unique. And so whenever you enter a system, you need to treat it as if it's a unique system and honor that context. So that's what I've been doing for 20 years. I'm going to start sharing my screen. I hope you guys are able to see that. I just need to start the slideshow as well and get to my keynote. Sorry, this is the problem sometimes with Mac. It's almost too clever. So it won't let me start the keynote presentation before I share my screen, which is really stupid. There we go. Can you see the presentation?
Yep, looks good.
Yep.
So I have to admit, when James invited me, I think it was about 2 years ago, I wrote a blog post on the complexities of responsible leadership. And James invited me to come and speak about that. And I had a moment of, panic, because I didn't know how I could speak about that for a full 30 minutes. But as I started going into this topic, it kind of became more and more interesting. I just came from another conference where they are discussing the development goals, these big global SDGs that they talk about, the sustainable development goals. And this notion of responsible leadership and responsibility is becoming more and more pertinent, because we are facing more and more of these really complex challenges. And so I thought it could be, really interesting for us to explore not only, the idea of leading in complexity, but this notion of responsibility in your context and how we can make meaning of that. So I'm not going to talk too much about complexity. I know that you've, already spent quite a bit of time on this with Gary, but maybe just a reminder, that complexity arises from the connections between things. So it's a very different kind of system where things are connected in ways that's nonlinear. Small events in one part of the system can have big impacts in other parts of the system. But I think maybe most pertinent for this conversation about responsibility, it's almost that because things are unpredictable, because there are so many different connections, the one thing that we can be sure of is that there will be unintended consequences. And then that leads to a very interesting conversation around what does responsibility mean in that context, and what are we responsible for? But maybe before we go there, I thought I would make sense of responsibility using the Cynefin framework that you've now been introduced to by Gary. And it's interesting when I started thinking about this, I think the typical meanings that we hold to the word responsibility tend to sit on the ordered side of the Cynefin framework. So in the clear domain, it's about following rules, following orders, compliance, following best practices. That is what responsible means in that context. And then in complicated, this is where we need to do our due diligence. We need to consult with experts, and we need to make sure that we're consulting quite broadly and not speaking to only one or two, experts with potentially biased views. We need to think about the various scenarios. We need to do contingency planning. And so those are the things that we tend to see as being responsible in the colloquial sense of the word. But now if I move over into complex, here I need to start thinking about making things safe to fail, because remember, there can always be unintended consequences. And sometimes here I need to break the rules. And this is where it starts becoming really interesting, because essentially what this says is that what is responsible in one context. So if I'm in an ordered context, it's really responsible to follow rules and be compliant and follow best practices. But those same rules and the same practices can actually become dangerous or risky for me when the context shifts and I suddenly find myself in complexity. And so there's almost a bit of a dichotomy here in terms of what it means to be responsible in different contexts. And then, of course, in chaos, here we need to act fast. Sometimes we need to exert moral judgment. So we need to make, if I think of COVID-19 and some of the choices that needs to be made now, do you choose for, the benefit of an individual or for the benefit of a collective? How do you make these decisions? And how do you stay in it? So how do you not go into fight or flight and run away? I think those are aspects of responsibility that sit in that chaotic domain. But I think as I was making sense of this, I certainly became aware that responsibility, we all assume that we know what that word means. But then as soon as we start applying this thinking to it, then it's not so simple anymore. And what I also realized is it's not quite as cut and dried as even this exercise makes it out to be, because it's not responsible in any of these domains to blindly obey and follow rules, except maybe in chaos. And so as I was, preparing for this talk, where I kind of landed was responsibility is not such a simple thing. And especially if we consider, the reality that we can always trigger unintended consequences. And maybe just quickly, what is the problem then with rules? And the best way that I know how to describe that is, rules tend to be context agnostic. And what we tend to find is that if something happens that we hadn't planned for, we create a new rule. And over time, we create rule books so thick that nobody ever reads them. It almost becomes unusable for us. But maybe just a quick, this is something that we like to do whenever we explain complexity, but this is something that comes from Max Boisot and his mathematics of dots. But essentially, if I've got 4 dots, 6 possible links between those dots, then 64 possible patterns can form. Now, maybe in the chat, and Gary, I can't see the chat easily, if you can monitor that for me. For those of you who haven't seen this before, if you had to take a wild guess, if I go up to 10 dots, 45 possible links, take a guess, how many patterns do you think can form? And Gary, if you could just let me know what's in the chat.
Okay, one person has said millions with a
Okay.
question mark.
Millions?
Millions.
Anybody think it's more? Do you think it's less?
Higher, lower? Oh, 500.
500, okay.
Okay, question, yeah. Anybody else? Trillions.
Recently, I had several people who told me the answer is 4510. Because, people are really good at spotting patterns. I don't know if you can see where that comes from, but in the first row, it's like the 6 and the 4 make 64. So maybe just so, I think you guys have either seen this before, your mathematics, but the right answer is 35 trillion. And then if I go up to 12 dots, 66 links, I don't even know what that number means. I just know I want it in my bank account. But I think, the moral of the story here is that there is just no way that we can possibly prepare for every eventuality. If you just think of dots as just as people in your team, in human systems, we do have certain propensities and there's dispositional states in human systems that make them a little bit more predictable. So I know that my friends are more likely to be home than out clubbing over a weekend, but I can't predict where they'll be this Friday. And for us to try and prepare and create a rule for every possible eventuality is simply not possible. And so thinking that it's always responsible to follow a rule is also, that is irresponsible in itself. And that's just for those of you who wanted the equation. And so where I ended up with this is I felt the need to almost problematize this idea of responsibility. And to do kind of the starting place for me is to go to the definition of the word, like what does responsibility mean? And so I just Googled it, as you know, Google knows everything. And this is what came up. I think this is the Oxford Dictionary. And I've just highlighted a couple of words for you here. So there's a moral obligation. So there's almost like a moral side to responsibility. There's behaving correctly. And then immediately the question would be, who decides what is correct and what isn't? It's linked to agency or personal agency. It's, can I take responsibility for my own actions and my own emotions? There's a legal obligation to it. There's a sense of duty. It links to notions of control. It leads to culpability, or when things go wrong, who's to blame, which also then links to liability. And then it's close cousin accountability, because you'll see here the fact or condition of being accountable is having responsibility. This is linked to notions of obedience and again compliance. And I think where I landed with this is, I think that the word responsibility has become problematic, because it's inextricably intertwined with notions of blame, compliance, conforming to rules, social norms. And nowadays, when we're dealing with complexity, then compliance, conforming to rules, all of these things are not really helpful in complex contexts. And also, if the idea of being accountable or taking responsibility, even if it's on an unconscious level, is also linked to who might be culpable or who might be to blame, this leads to all kinds of behavior in our systems that we don't necessarily want. It leads to people not talking about failure, hiding near misses. And I think it undermines our psychological safety. And so where does this leave us? And where I landed was, I think we need to move from thinking about responsibility and being responsible to being response-able. So the ability to respond appropriately in the context that you're in. And this, as you can think, it links, almost directly now then to Cynefin. So we need to, one of the first things that I think potentially is a key for us to become response-able leaders. And I don't want to make this only about leadership. I think this is about anybody who needs to make decisions, whether you're operational on the front lines, whether you're in the cockpit of an aircraft, or whether you're in the control tower, whether you're one of the people who built the aircraft and you're responsible for ensuring safety there. Doesn't matter where you are. I think everybody needs to cultivate contextual intelligence. And linking back a little bit to the conversation that we had just before I started the presentation, I think part of this is creating a shared language. As Gary said, if we can all agree something is complex, then we all understand that we need to be interacting with the system, we need to be probing. So it removes a lot of, or it mitigates a lot of conflict. But I think it's really important for us to make sure that everybody in the organization starts understanding that contexts are not all the same, and that rules and even best practices don't transfer necessarily between different contexts. So we need to cultivate this ability to ask questions. Even if it's not about breaking a rule, it's about continuously questioning, is this still relevant? Is this policy or procedure that we're following, is it still helpful? Is it still relevant? Or do we need to rethink because the context around us has shifted? And then the next one is we need to cultivate complexity fitness. And here, I use this image of the guy in the suit surfing, because I think sometimes we underestimate just how different we need to show up when we are in complexity versus when we are in an ordered system. And how very often we can be very uncomfortable when we suddenly find ourselves in complexity. I listen to people now, in this COVID context, talking about when are we going back to normal? Or what is the new normal? You know, this word normal is coming up a lot. And I think it's almost become a bit of a code word for when are we going back to stability and certainty and predictability? I think that's kind of what we see as normal. And one of the things that I've had to really make peace with myself is I think that unpredictability and uncertainty and instability, I think that is actually what's normal. And that these last few decades of relative stability, that is what's abnormal. And so understanding that we are ourselves complex systems embedded and entangled into other complex systems. And all of these are flow systems. You know, if you think about it, your life is a flow through time and space. Even just, you know, your organization, you know, as time unfolds, change happens, learning happens. It's all part of a flow. And so I think the better we can get at not becoming anxious when we're facing uncertainty, if we can find a way of befriending uncertainty, if we can cultivate the ability to not just react, you know, when we feel uncomfortable, to try and stamp out tension or make things predictable, if we can be in the ambiguity and the uncertainty and learn to respond to, you know, I love, you know, this is agency, for example, to have agency. The meaning that's ascribed to that is to have individual and collective capacity to act and respond intentionally. And so for me, complexity fitness is all around managing ourselves so that we don't just react and we're able to respond appropriately. So it's again that response ability. And then I really think that we need to find new language. You know, I think if responsibility and accountability have, you know, become synonymous with obedience and compliance and who's blamable, then I think our language is creating perverse effects. You know, even, you know, in this previous conference where I just came from, they're trying to crowdsource the inner development goals, the things that human beings, the capacities that human beings need to develop to be able to respond to these big global challenges like climate change, for example. And some of the things coming out are things like perseverance and humility and gratitude and courage. And it almost feels as if we've got so many meanings already related to those words, so many judgments, I guess, already, that it feels like we need to find a completely different language for these new skills and the new ways of being in the world. And so I guess a challenge for us would be, can we find different language? Because especially in business context, you know, this idea of you need to be accountable, you need to take ownership, who is responsible, you know, that language permeates. And I think it is having perverse effects. And I think one of those is it's undermining the psychological safety in our environments. And then I think a really pragmatic thing that we can do is to create a rule for when it's okay to break the rules. I think Gary mentioned that in a previous session, you already started touching on this idea of heuristics. But to make it okay that under certain conditions, you know, and I don't know what this would look like in your context, but when the context shifts in a certain way or when certain conditions are met, then it's okay to break the rules. But when you do, you need to do it intentionally. And when you step across that boundary, now the focus is on heuristics. And heuristics are really interesting because, you know, it's like rules of thumb. One of the more famous ones is Napoleon, who told his troops to march to the sound of the guns. So regardless of context, it's something, you know, that heuristic holds. It's able to flex, so it can be adapted to context. Whereas this particular rule, when the context shifts, it becomes brittle and it's no longer useful. So how can we develop and extract heuristics? Because these heuristics will already be there. And I think part of the SenseMaker exercise that Gary and Cengiz prepared, you know, is around heuristics. But where we tend to find these is that experts tend to have or to follow emergent heuristics. they know when they need to break the rules. You know, I'm intentionally staying away from any aviation examples because I don't want to get myself in trouble. But I think if we look at what happened, you know, in the famous story of the Miracle on the Hudson, I think that is an example of where a heuristic was followed, not a rule. And it comes from expertise, from understanding when to safely break a rule. So how do we ritualize this? And I don't have answers, but I think this could be potentially useful for you as a community to discuss. And then I think the last thing is creating psychological safety and environments where people who are even in the most ordered roles, or people who are, you know, kind of low down on the hierarchy, can practice what is called intelligent disobedience. And you'll see the image on screen is of a dog. And Gary asked me, what does the dog have to do with this? But it's actually something that we can learn from how they train guide dogs. Because really expert guide dog trainers teach the dogs that under certain circumstances, they should not obey the order of the owner because it's dangerous. And this notion of intelligent disobedience, like when is the most responsible thing for you to do to not follow an order, to not follow a rule? And how do we create environments where it's safe to do that? Where people feel that if they see something that's unsafe, if they get under the impression that following a rule would not be the right thing to do, that they can practice this intelligent disobedience, the way that guide dogs are taught to do. And so that's it from my side. I wanted to see if I can finish a little bit earlier so that we can have a conversation. Gary, I don't know if there are any questions in the chat or comments or disagreements. Very happy to have those as well.
Yeah. James, what do you see?
We've got one question here. You may have answered it, I think. How do you see the role played by the stakeholders in the aviation industry, regulators, airline operators, users, in upholding safety in the industry in terms of sense of responsibility each of the stakeholders play? That's a tricky one.
Yeah.
Did you get that? Sorry, do you want me to go through it again?
I think I have it. Well, maybe, I mean, can we unmute him and so that he can maybe.
That I don't know.
Otherwise, I can give it a go.
Yeah, I think you're going to have to give it a go. I'm not sure how to do that one.
James, I can unmute the person. What was their name? Would you like me to?
Hafiz. I probably like completely mispronounced that.
Yeah, I'm glad you tried that.
Hafiz Abdul Aziz.
Oh, okay. Yep, I can search for that. Hang on.
Okay.
Sorry about this. Now I have allowed you to talk.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Yes. Hi, Sonia. Yeah.
Hello.
Well, yeah. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So coming back to the question, the tricky part is like you've established this concept of making sense of responsibility, right? So you know, I mean, going forward into the future, you know, the aviation industry is becoming more of a interdependent ecosystem. So, you know, what I'm trying to say is, you know, how do the stakeholders manage the responsibilities that each of them have in achieving, you know, or upholding the levels of safety within the industry?
I don't know if I have you know, an answer for that, but I can, you know, just some of the thoughts that come up for me, you know, is I think one of the things that we need to start doing is, you know, because along with this idea of responsibility and accountability, especially when it comes to who's to blame for what and who owns what, and, you know, that whole way of thinking also come very siloed. You know, you talk about the aviation industry becoming more of an interdependent ecosystem. if all of these individual stakeholders see their responsibility as very different and very bounded, it kind of works against the idea of an integrated ecosystem. So I think one of the things that we need to think about is collectively taking responsibility, but then also make it about collective learning, about not where does one stakeholder's responsibility end and somebody else's starts, and if something goes wrong, then who's to blame, but rather how do we create a coherent kind of a framework around safety to serve this collective. So I think it's about spanning the boundaries. I think it's about, again, reframing the language, because I just think this responsibility linked to culpability thing is really a problem. And so how do we start working across those boundaries would be, one of the key things that I would be interested in. How do we enable that?
Yeah. Actually, this is a great question because it's a segue into our next section. We're really start talking about, instead of taking that granular individual view, and that's where blame comes from, we actually go higher up and we look up instead of looking down, and we look at systems. And that's why I was so encouraged by the regulators saying that they want to look at it from a systems thinking point of view in February. And to me, this conference is a continuation of trying to look at the system and what are the constraints that are causing people to behave a certain way. And then we don't even have to talk about blame because blame doesn't come up anymore.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. We've got a question from Will Wright. Thanks for such thought-provoking presentation. What are the challenges of setting out this new language? You mentioned you have no answers. Where do you see the next steps, required work within the aviation industry, and where does it begin?
Again, I think that's what we're going to be doing the next half hour. We'll be introducing what we also do in Cognitive Edge, besides doing Cynefin framework, we actually look at SenseMaker and how do we gather stories. And that's what I want to do next. And hopefully we'll answer your questions. If not, by all means, we'll certainly can have a chat about that.
Okay, thanks. I've got one from Anders here who says, I think we have a rule to break rules in aviation, a general regulation saying something that you should do what is needed for safety. And I can probably answer this myself, to be honest. We do indeed. I think that there is a certain problem in the investigations in that we use a lot of counterfactuals when we do investigations, where we find that what should have happened, and the story is what isn't what actually happened, it's what should have happened, rather than looking at what actually did happen and why it made sense to the person at the time. I think that probably answers that question a bit more there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Andrew Rose, thanks for that, Sonia. I fully concur with your suggestion for a rule for when to break the rules, even as an aviator. The problem we have is that aviation system is focused on training people simply to follow rules and not to make decisions, good risk management decisions. What suggestions would you have for developing decision-making education within that context?
Sure. Well, I think the Cynefin framework and learning how to determine what context you're in is one part of it. What I'm really interested in, and now I must be careful not to go on a rabbit trail, but I've been very interested in looking at what's developing in the world of sports coaching, because they look at skills acquisition. So if you see decision making as acquiring a skill, what they do, they talk about constraints-led approaches to coaching. And it's the shift. So Gary mentioned soccer. It's the shift from putting people through skills drills and trying to teach a child, for example, what the correct way is to dribble a ball, which is, I guess, in this context, almost, like teaching people how to follow rules and how to do things right, versus putting them in environments where they manipulate the constraints so that certain opportunities present themselves. We talk about affordances. So affordances are invitations to act. So it's an opportunity to act. And the role of the coach, and in this case, then, you know, the person who's developing the learning experience would be, how do I create the conditions where certain opportunities to make decisions afford themselves? And we teach people how to see those affordances and how to be adaptive in a landscape, not how to follow rules. You know, so this is almost, how can I create an environment where gaps open up, that so that children can learn how to dribble through a gap, not how do I teach them how to dribble perfectly, because then they create adaptive players. And I think we can learn from that community if we bring some of that thinking across into how do we create ecologies of learning, not just training programs.
Thank you. Perfect. Is one from Neil. It can be argued that most of the points today are already required in aviation regulations. The rules themselves are not rigid. The attitudes are. We suffer from old-fashioned problems in a new era world and remain very siloed, as 737 MAX revealed. How do we gain real corporate buy-in, i.e. beyond compliant?
Yeah, that is the $1 million question, I think. One of the metaphors I use a lot is it's hard to survive in the jungle if you were trained in the zoo. And I think, unfortunately, most of our large corporates are essentially set up a little bit like zoos. And, you know, if you think about it, a zoo is a very safe and comfortable place. You know, we know how things work. I think what's challenging, and I've got a lot of empathy for some of these, you know, senior decision makers in large corporates, because expecting them to make this shift also essentially means that they need to come into a place where they're comfortable to say, I don't know, I need to learn. And it's almost like on that boundary of feeling competent and feeling incompetent, and nobody likes to be there. And so I think, as I said, I don't have answers. I think sometimes the zoo has become internalized. The zoo is in the mind. And it starts, I think, by normalizing where people are, because to my mind, it's the external context that has shifted. It's not that these people have suddenly become incompetent overnight. It's that the skills that brought them this far will not take them further. And so I think we need to take the judgment out of it and make it more about the external context and all of us needing to learn together, rather than, you know, you need to get out of your stuck mindset. You know, and as I said, you know, I don't really have the answers to this, and it's not only in the aviation industry, it's everywhere.
Okay, thank you. Last question, mindful of time, we need to move on. Thanks, Sonia, for excellent presentation. My question is how to create good balance between providing intelligent disobedience and personal accountability. Since at Gary's presentation, if I'm not mistaken, mentioned that work is located 95% of the time at clear and complicated area, while only 5% located at complex and chaotic.
I think, again, it goes back to context. I think it's this idea of psychological safety. You know, even if I'm only called to raise the alarm once in my entire career, I think I need to know that one time when it's needed, that it's safe to do so. You know, and there's lots of research, for example, about how we treat whistleblowers, et cetera, et cetera. So this idea of psychological safety, I think, is key in this. And I personally think part of your personal accountability is to have the courage and to take, I guess, responsibility, if you want to call it that, when you see something that could potentially lead to a disaster and falling over the cliff, that you raise it. So I guess my question is more along the lines of how do we create the environments that make it easier for people to do that? Because unfortunately, in most of the contexts where I work, there are negative consequences to the people who actually put themselves forwards and raise the alarm. So I think it's about the environment more than the person, maybe.
Thank you for that. Right, I think we need to move on, and Gary's taking the next section. Thank you very much for that, Sonia.
Pleasure, James.
Okay, so let me take over. I was just waiting for my screen sharing to start. Has it started for you?
Not yet, Gary.
Chat. Okay. So not quite sure where my went to sleep here. So
That's got your whole screen now.
got the whole screen there. Okay, well that's not good. So let me. I may have to. Okay, do that. Okay, so let me just, I may have to restart my PowerPoint. So let me just check that. Let me just do that, do that. Let's just see, looks like my PowerPoint is stuck. Okay, so let me end that. That present view. Okay, so bear with me, folks. I am going to have to. Somehow I've lost my PowerPoint slides, so I'm not sure what's happened here. And this is a Mac, Sonia. It's supposed to just work.
Yeah, the keywords there, Gary, is supposed to.
Yeah.
But it's still better than a Windows machine, so.
Yeah, it's okay. Let me just cancel out. I'm gonna have to start again. Sorry about that, folks. Let me just see if I can bring the whole thing and start all over again. Where are we? Okay. Okay, we're almost there. Oops. All right, hang on. Let me do it this way. Okay, I think, let me just see where my screen is. I can share this, and I think we're good to go.
Looks good.
Okay. Okay, everybody close their eyes because I have to flash forward a lot to get my 22nd part. Okay. Okay, we're up and running. Good. Okay, so for this section, I want to do is kind of take it down to where we are in context at the operational level. In February, Adam Johns told us how words created worlds in the work that they did in trying to implement Safety 2 at Cathay Pacific. And they discovered the world of safety is filled with negative language, errors, accidents, injuries, violations, non-compliances. And he said, well, instead of using evaluative words, let's change to use descriptive words, what people are doing, not what they should or shouldn't do. Then Val State spoke about how the data collected quantitatively could be represented qualitatively as patterns and trends, enhance our sense making. And this is a theme that I really picked up about looking from a systems point of view, looking up as opposed to down. And as I mentioned here, that way, hopefully we can get away from the blaming and maybe look at the constraints that are causing people to behave this way. Stories, as we know, are really powerful. We are storytellers and naturally good at it. We share stories at work and at home, It's how family traditions and rituals are passed down from generation to generation. Stories are a huge component of any culture, in this case, safety culture. Behaviors are above the waterline, and we can see them. So this kind of relates back to Stephen Schirach's diagram of showing this pyramid and then later an iceberg. Stories are below the waterline, way down in the iceberg. Stories provide context in terms of deep feelings and emotions. Early detection means capturing, I've got a bad feeling about this, before the stories turn into those, if I only known, if I wish I had said something before about that. Well, what's the difference between the story and narrative? In February, Val and Ivan talked about the complex narrative. So what's the difference? Well, you can see that stories, the terms are interchangeable, but they are different. A story is made up of events that happened, but a narrative really is the order in which events are told. And if you shuffle the order, you can actually create a narrative of the same story. The key is that narratives turn story into information. And it's how we as recipient perceive what happened. So this notion of trying to seek the one truth is not realistic, since the story can be told in many ways. And I believe this is what Bell and Ivan talked about, the complex narrative. As I previously highlighted, learning processes have a collection step and an analysis sense-making step. This is a sense-maker process developed by Dave Snowden. It's also a learning process. As you will soon experience, we can collect narratives online from anyone, anywhere, 24/7, 365. We call this distributed ethnography. In the analysis and sense-making step, we look at these patterns that are formed by the narratives in a real-time dashboard. SenseMaker is a pattern detection software and an underlying methodology that adheres to the basic principles of working in a complex adaptive system. The SenseMaker process collects the data anonymously. And of course, when we do that, we can create a psychologically safe environment. In addition, we eliminate the chances of an internal analyst or external consultant misinterpreting your narrative. You know, it's that, oh, I know what this person is saying because I've seen this before problem. Well, we avoid that. How do we do this? We ask you to signify your narrative by moving markers in triangles and sliders. On the left is a triangle, or a triad, as we call it. How did you have your last cup of coffee or tea? And where you move the marker tells us what happened. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just you providing deeper meaning to your narrative. If you've heard the term authentic voice, this is what you are sharing and we are capturing. On the right is a dyad, which has two extreme points. You move the marker into position where it makes sense to you. So why is this better than traditional surveys? I'm sure we've all filled out surveys like Likert rating scales. The scale gives us the preferred choice. So depending on how I'm feeling that day, I can game my answer. During my time as a strategic planner, I was a big user of SurveyMonkey to design surveys. I would show bar charts and pie diagrams to present the findings to senior leaders. But we also knew at this level, the numbers were typically an average of several experiences over a given time. So if we wanted to take an improvement action, we would look at a score, 6 out of 10, which is an averaging. That's why, because a person probably had one day a 2 experience and later had a great experience at 10. But because it's over time, they average it and they give us a 6. What always worried me is that one of the senior leaders would say, well, let's move the needle to an 8. Then I would kind of go like, oh my God, I don't even know what 6 means. What do I do with 8? So what we would do is turn to the survey comments as they provided context. Useful comments would be experiences telling us what's working and not working. And how's the best way people share experiences with context? Well, that's storytelling. Tricia Wang is an ethnographer who listens to storytellers in the field. In her TEDx talk, she explains that big data answers the who, what, where, when questions. And she coined the term thick data, a small sample of stories to add human insights missing from big data. Thick data answers the why question. With distributed ethnography, we can actually do better because we can capture a big sample. Dave Slonin says we can get rich data. The same qualitative narratives are converted to quantitative dots by SenseMaker, which can be filtered and displayed in different ways. In the triad shown, people in the organization are collectively experiencing scheduling work problems. You can see the cluster there. Same data, it's just a different perspective. And this is what we really want to do. And what we have as our kind of interactive exercise is that we've actually created a collaborative study between BALPA and the Cranfield University. And we're going to actually introduce, using SenseMaker software, an opportunity to start the collection phase. If you recall, in the second day Q&A panel discussion, a question was raised about collecting and sharing data across airlines. Yeah, I can see how it could take some time for big data to come together with so many different systems, but rich data, we can do that now. We can do that today, starting. After we spend some time, and Genghis comes up and explains what that looks like, we can actually come back, go live, and show you the dashboard in real time. These are your stories. These are these dots. Each dot is a story. This is what you have entered. On the left is a triad heat map and a narrative landscape map on the right. A map also affords a sense of direction. In this illustration, we have for the axis getting a quality of work done, and for the y-axis, we talk about either bending or staying within the rules. In this illustration, it would be most desirable to move from the red X position, and there seems to be a cluster if you understand contour maps, and move that over to the green check mark. In other words, the green check mark is where we're getting the work done. Hey, and we can do that within the rules that are there. So the intervention question actually becomes fairly easy to ask. How can we get fewer stories in the red X area and more stories over into the green check mark? But the starting point, of course, is we need to create a map of what our current reality is. And I'm actually quite curious and excited to see what patterns are going to emerge from the entries that you're going to make today. So at this point, I think we're going to take a break. Let me just stop sharing my screen. Okay. And it's well, my clock says 6:54. I'm just getting up in the morning. So how about if we take a break and we come back at 3:15, Jody? And then we'll start off with Genghis, and he can introduce the study to you. He'll kind of walk it through you. Then we'll give people time that they can actually fill it out. And like I said, we'll come back and we'll look at the data together. It should be a fun time.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Gary, and thank you to Sonia. I know she's potentially having some technical issues, but fantastic start to the session this afternoon. I think you set the context really well, and there's some very thought-provoking discussions we've had already. So yeah, as Gary says, we'll take a break, we'll reconvene at 15 past the hour. You don't need to log out of the session, so just keep your Zoom session live, and we'll see you back here in about 20 minutes. Thank you.